we want to go somewhere else.
Hello, and welcome to the Fear of God podcast. Here at the Fear of God, we find the holy in the horrific at the intersection of faith and fear, dissecting what scares us in order to find what saves us. Speaking to you right now is one of your hosts, Nathan Rouse, and typically with me, as you all know, is fellow co-host Reed Lackey. But you know, Reed was here a minute ago, then he muttered something that sounded like winged bat plagues Gotham. Soon to be followed by, wait till they get a load of me. Sadly, for all of us, we will never quite know the meaning of that loaded statement because I imagine plaguing Gotham most certainly takes more than an hour, and that's about all we got for this episode. But fret not, foggers. It won't just be me flapping my gums solo because we have a very special B-side today. Today's episode is one more thing I have to thank artist extraordinaire Jacob Hunt for, in addition to his fantastic Fear of God art he's provided for us. Jacob, as you may know, was featured on our Joker episode just a few weeks ago. That episode launched our Best of 2019 series and our podcasting year for 2020. Now, as far as Joker goes, for all the hot takes surrounding it, that film remains an enigmatic and compelling one, Trojan horsing an examination of mental health under the clown makeup of a comic book film. One that, by the way, happened to go on to gross over $1 billion worldwide, that's billion with a B, and earn Joaquin Phoenix a Best Actor Oscar, and the film itself multiple other nominations and awards beyond just the Oscars. So what is today about? Well, the day after our Joker episode released, Jacob sent me a link to a Washington Post article about the film with the title, "As the child of someone with paranoid psychosis, Joker resonated with me." Yes, loaded title, and immediately I was intrigued. I proceeded to read the article and subsequently be totally taken in with it, as well as by the writer's transparency and vulnerability. All I could think while reading it was, this is exactly what we try to do here on the show. Find the holy in the horrific. Dissect what scares us to find what saves us. So I looked up the author, whose name is Robyn Bahr, and in the crazy connected world in which we live these days, thought I'd reach out to her and thank her for her writing. And then thought, well, why not? I'll ask her if she'd like to be interviewed for the pod, and well, here we are. So I want to go ahead and stop prattling for a moment and say, Robyn Bahr, welcome to the Fear of God. Thank you for being here and willing to take a chance and on this weirdo little show we do.
Well, thank you for having me.
You are so very welcome. Thank you for being willing to carve out some time to be on the show. So, Robyn, I've done a little bit of reading of yours, but this is all kind of very new to our listeners. So, do me a favor so that they can get to know you a little bit. If you don't mind, fill us in a little bit on yourself, maybe, where you're based, and how you find yourself writing about Joker for the Washington Post.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me again. So I live in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Have not lived here all my life. I'm actually from New York. And I just found myself in this crazy little town up in Massachusetts. I have been writing more full-time in the past 4 years. I call myself a film and television critic. I mostly write about TV. That's more my medium of choice, although I'm a big film person as well. And I do have a full-time job. So this is like my fun gig, so to speak.
Sure.
It's a big part of my identity. Well, many of us have full-time jobs,
Yes,
right? We like
yes.
benefits. So I've been doing this for more regularly for about 4 years, but I've been writing about film as long as I can remember in general, my first piece of film criticism, I was looking it up today, was from 2004 in my high school newspaper, and I wrote a very scathing review of Fahrenheit 9/11.
Oh, wow.
So,
all right.
yeah. And it was pretty hilarious, actually. So I've been doing this for quite a bit, and the idea for the Joker article almost came up as like a joke, because I was thinking of titles of articles I didn't think I could ever write. So this was a particularly interesting year for film for me. I loved the movie Uncut Gems. I highly recommend it. It has a certain flavor to it. I think I don't know if you've seen it.
Not yet. It's on the list.
Yeah, it's really fabulous. And the film reminds me quite a bit of my father for many different reasons.
Huh.
And if you've seen it, you might think, oh, that's a little bit weird. But
Did he get overlooked by the Oscars as well?
Well, yes. I was very, very sad that Adam Sandler did not get an Oscar
Yes,
nomination.
indeed.
He truly should have won, in
Wow.
my opinion. I mean, I think that Joaquin Phoenix was wonderful in this movie.
Sure.
Probably my second favorite performance of the year, but I did love Adam Sandler in this. So I was, and of course, Joker, as we'll talk about, reminded me quite a bit of my mother. So I was kind of writing out these like funny headlines, like "Why Uncut Gems?" reminds me of my dad, like very like clickbaity
Sure.
article ideas, and I was writing them out in my just like a blogging community I belong to, and a friend of mine was like, "Why can't you write it? Like, I would love to read this piece." And I was like, "All right, I don't know, guess I'll throw it out there." So, I pitched it out, it was accepted, and here we are several weeks later. And yeah, I was actually very nervous putting this article out for many different reasons.
Yeah.
And I've actually gotten a pretty nice response. So
now I've read probably about 4 or 5 of your pieces, and I'll let you plug your website and where people can find you here in a minute. But do you tend to go this kind of vulnerable with the stuff you write?
Oh, opposite.
Yeah.
I usually do straight criticism.
Sure.
I mean, sometimes I'll throw in like a funny anecdote here and there just so that the reader understands where I'm coming from. Like I wrote a piece about a year ago on why I love Lifetime and why the network was super important to me as a kid growing up in a household where it was maybe a little more conservative or something.
Sure.
And so Lifetime gave me a lot of opportunity to engage with in the world of women, so to speak, or what women go through. So that was maybe my most personal piece, and this definitely was like excavating a deep dark mine that I very rarely go down.
Sure.
And we can definitely talk more about that. But I definitely do mostly straight criticism. I write. I mean, my main publication that I work with is The Hollywood Reporter. I love working with them.
Cool.
I have a great editor. And like I said, I write mostly TV, so this was a very different thing for me. It's kind of scary.
I'm sure. Well, you can validate this. When I initially approached you about even chatting about this, I was like, hey, I know it was probably hard to even put yourself out there in the writing. I don't want you to feel like you have to do this because, I mean, what this particular piece is very vulnerable, and we'll get to that. But I do, to your credit, I mean, I think, I have no clue because this is mine and yours first time conversing, but in terms of what the general response has been. But, one thing I found so compelling about it is a lot of what we try to do here on our show, which is, and now Joker, the film, is pretty compelling and so merits some consideration and thoughtfulness. But, what we try to do here is just, okay, even if it's not high art, like what at least Joker purports to be, there's still things you can find that will resonate and that you can pull out. And as a brief little anecdote here, listeners will know, I didn't think a whole lot of the film Phantasm. We actually covered it here on the show from the late 70s. It's a pretty wild, just bonkers kind of horror flick from, I think, 78 or 79. But what was interesting about covering it for the show was the film itself is a lot about death and dying and fear of that. And it spun into this like really deep conversation. And I was like, I don't even really care for this movie, but I'm really impressed, And so to your credit, I think, what you kind of were willing to put down in terms of how this film inspired you is really, really courageous on your part. And so I applaud you for that. So how, you referenced Uncut Gems specifically, and adjacent to that, of course, is the Oscar conversation. In doing my research, I'll let you plug your website here, but I did see that you and I are of like mind surrounding our, I think, ecstatic response to Parasite's winning Best Picture in addition to everything else. How about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, what a
Wasn't that great?
Moment. Probably the best moment since Moonlight.
Yeah,
which was like the moment of all time, in my opinion.
Well,
no, it was fabulous.
I am in Charlotte, North Carolina, and my sister lives here locally and always throws a little Oscar party. Well, she doesn't have kids. We have 3 kids, and getting out on a Sunday night is just hard, right? And so, but my wife and I keep blowing off these Oscar parties every year because it gets down to the wire and we're like, oh gosh, we're just too tired. This is hard. Well, this year I was like, no, our kids are a little old enough now that we could, kind of jaunt out for the evening. But even going, and I don't know if you're familiar with the podcast, The Big Picture. It's part of the Ringer Network. I listen to that a good bit. And
no, I haven't.
You'd enjoy it, but they follow the latter part of the year's awards programs. In other words, like the BAFTAs and, PGA and all that sort of stuff. And 1917 just kept winning. And I've seen 1917 and it's a solid film. It's fine. It's great. But going into the Oscars, I was like, man, I really want Parasite to win. And it's not going to happen. It's just not. I even told my wife on the way. I told her on the way there, I was like, I'm just kind of prematurely bummed here because we're gonna go and I just need something good in the world to happen, and it's not gonna happen. It's fine. 1917 is fine, and
the nomination was enough.
I know. Well, then sure enough, and I joked on the Fear of God Parasite episode, we did a little debrief after the Oscars and threw it on the front end of that episode, and I joked, I was like, man, I just I needed a good exaltation like that. It has been a while since I felt good enough in my inner self to be like, I don't watch sports. I don't care for them really. And so I don't have that catharsis that a lot of American men have, where you're watching the sports and you're cheering for your team. I don't get that. And so what I lean on is media. And when my movie
Oscars
wins,
are my Super Bowl.
Exactly. Before we get to your Joker thoughts specifically as represented in your article, I did want to ask you a 2-part question that we tend to ask most folks who guest on the show for the first time. And one, so Robyn, we clearly here specialize in the horror genre. I'm curious, one, do you have a particular aversion, or do you appreciate horror stuff? And you can loosely define it as thriller or suspense. And if you kind of lean into that, do you have any favorite horror films or suspense films that you would identify as, favorites that you really enjoy?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny to think about the horror genre because I wouldn't I've never really defined myself as like a horror writer or anything like that. And I don't tend to write about films in a particularly genre oriented way, but I would say I'm a big horror fan, actually. Not slasher films. I don't like that, but I love body horror movies. Anything with like really graphic practical effects, bodily transformations, like The Fly, like really like gross stuff. I love anything like that. That is a gross one, yeah. I loved Hereditary. I loved Midsommar.
Yes.
I loved Hereditary more than Midsommar, but there's so many images from that film that I will never forget, or so many feelings from that film I will never forget. I mean, it's very hard to scare me. So the fact that Hereditary scared me multiple times, it will definitely be up there for me. And I also really enjoy non-traditional horror movies. Like Sunset Boulevard to me is like a classic horror film.
Interesting.
I love Eraserhead.
Gotcha.
Talking about body horror. So yeah, things of Lynch, things of Michael Haneke. Michael Haneke. I actually don't know how to pronounce it. Like The Piano Teacher or Das Weiße Band. Like anything that has that like creeping feeling.
Sure.
I do love. But my visceral favorite is anything that is like disgusting. like
That's
Brain Dead or whatever.
hilarious.
Dead Alive or something like that.
You owe it to yourself when you have a little time and want to listen to a podcast to go listen to our episode on the fly. In addition to,
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah,
it's hysterical listening to me because, it's funny you said you wouldn't necessarily identify yourself as quote unquote horror fan or that you write about it traditionally. I come into the genre really by way of read. I historically like, thriller type material, but doing this show kind of shoved me in the deep end. And that's why it isn't the current art, but our previous show art is him as Dr. Frankenstein and me as Frankenstein's monster, kind of echoing that, created idea. But yes, I had seen The Fly long before we covered it for the show. But I'd forgotten just how disgusting it is. So,
it's bad.
Oh man, it's so nasty.
Yeah, anything like the grosser the better, in my opinion.
That's hilarious. We'll have to have you back on to with something of your choosing. Yeah, that'd be actually a lot of fun. You get to pick what it is if we haven't covered it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate.
Yeah, that'd be a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's funny because like women. I feel like women are kind of outside of talking about horror in some ways when actually. Traditionally, women were among the first group of people that embraced horror. If you go back to like Gothic novels or anything like that, Mary Shelley, whatever. Like we love that stuff. But I think for some reason the conversation goes around it a little bit. Like I can't tell you how many little girls I know that just love to be disgusted and love to be scared.
That's hilarious.
Definitely an untapped market.
Yeah, I'm trying to definitely not body horror yet, but trying to wean. I've got an 11 and a 9-year-old, and they
talk about body horror.
Yeah, definitely not. They dabble a little bit, your Coralines, your stuff like that. That's a little skirting that sort of. My 9-year-old I did just introduce to the Twilight Zone as kind of a fun, ramp into that world. Well, cool. Awesome. So Robyn is about the body horror. Good to know. We'll log that away. So also another question, knowing your specific vocation keeps your finger on the pulse of the TV and film world unrelated to horror. And you've referenced Uncut Gems already. So that one doesn't qualify. Is there something you've seen recently that either really struck a nerve positively or negatively, or something you just loved that you'd recommend us check out? We Uncut Gems we receive. What else? What else you got?
There are two things I've been going around talking about. Number one is Harley Quinn, not the movie, but the TV show.
Okay.
The DC film. So I'm not a comic book person, but I think Harley Quinn is like a very, very funny TV show. It's a cartoon about a woman who breaks up from her boyfriend and starts her own business, except her business is becoming a supervillain.
Nice.
It's a very funny show, and it's also a very good show about divesting yourself from an abusive relationship. And I actually think the show does it very well, while also being very, very, very funny. And the other thing that I've loved lately is kind of horror adjacent, which is Chernobyl.
Okay.
I don't know if you've seen it, but oh my God, it is fantastic. It is like, I don't know how they did this in 5 episodes, but it's a historical drama, a political thriller, a sci-fi mystery, and like a disaster flick all in one 5-episode group of episodes.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's a mini series,
right,
obviously.
Right.
Yeah,
it definitely was on a lot of lists, and I am intrigued. I did watch the first one, and it's kind of slow, and routine listeners to our show know that I'm in a stage of life where I fall asleep rather easily in pieces of media. And so I think I'll just have to take Chernobyl in drips and drabs. But I do know it is well respected. Now, let me ask you, what is Harley Quinn on? Because I didn't even know the cartoon existed. I did see the film this past weekend, but I didn't even know the cartoon existed. What is that on?
It's on DC Universe. Which
oh,
is kind
okay.
of like one of
yeah,
the
their
hidden...
subscription services.
I know, it's so sad because it really should be on like Cartoon Network or one of the more abrasive networks or something. But it is very good if you are able to come across it. It's very funny.
Well, apparently I didn't stay through the end credits of the film, but there's no scene, just spoiler alert everybody, there's no scene at the end of Harley Quinn credits, but there is an audio sort of note that Margot Robbie does that apparently ties into the cartoon. And so just so you know, if you end up going to see Harley Quinn, know that, or the Birds of Prey, the film, at the very end of it, there's a tag on to the cartoon. Very cool. Well, thank you for those offerings there. So Harley Quinn, Chernobyl, Uncut Gems, definitely things to add to the list. All right. Do you feel like talking about Joker?
Yeah.
Awesome. So, you know, I promise it's not because you're a guest that I'm just puffing you up here for what I think is the real value of the piece you wrote.
Please puff.
Yes. You know, I can't articulate enough that when I read it, I was like, wow, this is just really what we are after in audio format, at least. You know, this idea of kind of personal excavation in response to whether it's pop culture or art, whatever, however we want to mix all those things together. And for me, I've, especially just in the last, real deliberately since we started this show, but even more with intentionality in the last, 6 months to a year, I've more consciously been attempting lately to, whatever the takeaway from a given film we cover is to try to kind of self-apply ideas that versus what can happen, which is you get kind of lost in sort of vague generalities or just kind of stop at clinical assessment. Yeah. You know, like, oh, the movie is good and here's why, or the movie's bad and here's why, and, you know, kind of running with randomness. And so I've really tried to do that. And so I think that's one thing that really was a strength of your piece. It's funny. It made me think of the film Take Shelter. Are you familiar with Take Shelter?
I'm familiar with it, but I haven't seen it.
I don't know that you'll have the same type of response I will, but, or I did, but I love it. It is an easy kind of top 10, if not top 5 of all time for me. Jeff Nichols stuff is always compelling, wow. But that one specifically. And it made me, your article specifically and how you responded, though the scenarios are dramatically different, it's the depth of response that made me think of this. So when I went to see Take Shelter, when it was in theaters in 2011 or something like that, it was one of the first times that during the film, I almost walked out. And now, to be fair, wow. I've walked out of a film here and there before, but not for these particular reasons. It's mainly because I was just like, oh, yeah, I'm not going to watch this.
Like Air Bud.
Sure. Something. Yes, we'll go with that one. I'm trying to save my listeners from my browbeating some films that I tend to. But with Take Shelter, so I personally have a just kind of long history, and it's infrequent enough to not be like super problematic, but just frequently enough to be a thing where I have just like really terrible nightmares. And the film
like night terrors.
Yeah, well, it's like nightmares, like just real debilitating dream state kind of stuff that you wake up real shaken by in a real tactile way. And the film Take Shelter, I had no idea this was the content of it when I went to see it. Like, that is a type of thing that plagues the main character, and it was just really close to home, you know, kind of how it was affecting him, such that it almost, again, propelled me out of the theater. But thankfully I did not, because I do just adore this movie. But so that may seem like a random story, but that's just kind of what your Joker piece made me think of, this kind of deep excavation that is prompted sometimes by these pieces of culture we indulge. So a question for you, as far as Joker goes, did you anticipate, like, seeing trailers? Were you surprised by your response? Did you know from trailers, like, this may strike a chord, or was it kind of a completely blindsided kind of thing?
I didn't really get much. not like the biggest trailer person. I actually love going to movies and seeing trailers, but
Sure.
for films that I really like, I'll watch the first 30 seconds of a trailer, or not really like, but movies I really want to see, because I'm just like, you know what, I have a taste of it, and now I'm just going to let the film speak for itself instead of getting too caught up in
Sure.
what I think the movie is going to be. So I don't have any strong memories of seeing the trailer. I saw it and I said, oh, this looks good. This looks like shockingly good,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't. I didn't have the sense of like, oh, this is going to be particularly troublesome emotionally or anything like that.
Yeah. Well,
There are probably other topics that I would be like, oh, wow, like this looks really close to home, but not really that one.
sure. Yeah. What's funny, because I remember, and I go into this a little bit on our Joker episode, I remember seeing the trailer, and I, perhaps like many people, kind of woke up a good bit in fall of 2016 as an American person, as an American man, as an American white man in my case, and so I'm just, I'm just much more sensitive to kind of things than I would have been historically, and I watched a trailer for Joker when it first came out, and I was like, maybe, it just, I was like, I just don't know. And for me, I went into the film unsure. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm about to get, and did find myself just in that clinical assessment idea, I was really taken with the artistry at work, even if I wasn't 100% sure how to bucket everything. So I want people to read your article, of course, and like I said, we'll send it as widely as our reach allows, but can you go for as long or as short as you want and just kind of encapsulate a little bit what you kind of offer there? I referenced the title earlier, but just kind of dig a little deeper into the content of that for us real quick.
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason the article came about is because I have just seen so much what I would call like vitriolic discourse surrounding Joker. I mean, you definitely get into it in the episode, but and I talk about this in my article, but it's kind of a Rorschach test, right? Like everybody goes into it, with their own perspective. Obviously everybody goes into everything with their own perspective, but it seems to be one of those films, like if you really want it to be a white male manifesto, you're going to see it that way. And if you really want it to be like a call for revolution, like you'll see it that way. And it entirely does not surprise me that I went into this film thinking or reading it as a film about mental health, and the social impact of people who are particularly vulnerable in our society, because of their mental illness, or what have you. And there's a couple of reasons why I think that's maybe part of my identity. One, because I was raised by somebody who had a severe mental illness, which I talk about in my piece, and I'll get into in a second. And the other part of it is that one of my jobs, my full-time job, is actually working with students who have disabilities, and helping them figure out how to navigate the college environment, while they're kind of figuring out their own identities related to their disabilities and things of that nature. And some of it is physical or visible disabilities, but most of the students I work with have invisible disabilities, like mental health needs. It's probably the biggest population I work with, or things like learning disabilities. And, the age of 18 to 21 is pretty kind of rough on the brain for many reasons. Like your hormones are still changing and your brain is still pretty plastic. And there's a time in your life where your identities are starting to form in different ways and you're away from home. So there's all these different things that kind of coalesce. So I think about trauma and mental illness literally all day. So it's not surprising to me that I came into this film being like, this is what it's about. But one of the piece, just to describe it, is me talking about this discourse about Joker and kind of doing my but actually, because I think some people don't read it at all the way I do. The film is about a man who has this unspecified mental disability. We don't really know what it is. They sort of hint that it could be a traumatic brain injury or what have you, but it causes him to have these involuntary verbal reactions to people that other people find like creepy or disconcerting, that he has no control over. And I found like this was actually a very hard film for me to watch, not because it's violent or not because of like the art direction, which I actually really, I liked it. I liked the grimy feel of the film. But it was hard for me because it just, I mean, I hate overusing the word triggering because I feel like it's kind of this cultural
I know
buzzword or something, but like actually if you have a history of trauma, like it can be triggering to watch a film like this. And it's what my therapist calls like little t trauma. Like you don't have to have PTSD or something to have these trauma experiences. What we in psychology I think might call it a flashbulb memory, where like your emotions get encapsulated into these moments that you will like constantly like think back to because you almost like imprinted on them or something. So a lot of my experiences I write about in this piece are talking about what it was like growing up with a parent with a disability that was maybe adjacent to Joker's or Arthur Fleck's, and watching the film about a man who is kind of ground into this place of desperation and violence, and also thinking about my own response to my parent while I was growing up and how unfair I was to her when I was a kid, and how watching Arthur get sort of beaten down by other people and his services, his like social services get cut and people are constantly mocking him. It was painful for me to watch because I was a hard to raise kid in many ways. And I kind of felt this overwhelming feeling of like, oh man, I was so unfair to my mom. Like I would, I would do like impressions of her. And I would yell at her and scream at her. Oh my God, I was so horrible. I mean, and the funny thing is, like, when I was writing this piece, I was reminded that a lot of the times when I'll tell people about my life experience with my mom, although to be fair, I do talk about my dad a lot more, just because it's hard for people to relate to having a parent like mine. So I will often kind of frame it in these like funny stories, and many of them are very funny stories. Like, man, can you believe this whole thing? Like I had like part of the piece was one of the maybe my original opening paragraphs was actually how I found out my mom passed away.
Wow.
And I always present it as a very funny story because it was just like this comedy of errors. And then of course you're watching this film and it's all about comedy and how we look at ourselves. And so, writing this piece, I'm like, some of these are just like hard, like when you write them on paper they're not that funny. Like you have to sort of tell them out loud or something.
Well, something
or people don't know how to respond.
Well, something I'm going to steal one of your phrases here actually, because I'm staring at an excerpt. You talk about a coping mechanism and what you just described, this dissonance that happened between your history of telling the stories with some jokiness to it, and then the writing it out and thinking, there's something heavier there. And I just love this sentiment in your piece where you said, my coping mechanism was to other her, to shrink her power by making her feel the pain I felt when she endangered us. And the film, you go on to say, helped me face the guilt that is festered inside me. I just thought that was such a powerful assessment that requires a lot of self-awareness, but I think if there's much to be found in terms of value in art and art making, which I think there's a lot, but part of it is to close that gap, right? Between our attempts to other people, whether they are a parent or, pick a demographic that's not you, right? And this is a show that intertwines the notion of horror, or we can even just say pop culture and faith. And a lot of the conversations we have are attempts to wrestle with that. And something that I have found has been it's weird, the things that form you over a lifetime. Like, I know people who are very entrenched in the world of faith, and they're the most rigid, dogmatic, ridiculous people, the persona at least. And as we go about our lives and our days, and we envision these conversations with people who aren't like us, right? And there are moments where I'm like, how would I articulate why I can be so open and not be so rigid and dogmatic? And a lot of it has to do with cultural engagement and art engagement and art making. I don't know if you know this, but like my background's in the theater, and I produce theater and some of that kind of stuff. And so, but you keep yourself open to other people and their stories. And I just think that's such a valuable tool that at least in the circles I historically ran in, is something people are very closed off to. And I guess just as a note on your piece, what I found super helpful about your takeaway, because, and I know you listened to our Joker episode, you can kind of hear me wrestling, because I re-listened to them. I was wrestling with, like, I feel the empathy. I can't decide how to reconcile it with what I think are some of the struggles that the film has, just the craft of it at work. And then, I do struggle with the things Todd Phillips would say publicly. I was like, come on, man, like,
the kindness thing.
Yeah. Which, isn't wrong. It's just, he would boneheadedly stick his foot in his mouth, I thought, a good bit of time. But what was so helpful about your piece for me as an individual and art consumer was, with media criticism and consumption, I feel like we often need the eyes and experiences of others to help us see what we're not kind of wired to on first pass, right? Like, it was because your intersection with the film Joker was dramatically different than mine, but you kind of unlocked, like, oh, okay, yes, what I'm kind of feeling is there, but don't know how to either articulate or sort of, cogently wrestle down. You were able to sort of put, even though we hadn't met, but put a face to, in terms of like, this is really powerful, that, and I think what really great art can do for us, which is, not just, create empathy, but in the creating of that empathy, close that gap between, again, a parent or just the other in our world, in our midst, that kind of thing. I'm tempted to kind of throw a thought in here, but I'm worried it derails us a little bit. But purely in the analogy of rising back to the surface a tiny bit from the depths here, does like, you mentioned not being really into comic book stuff, which actually may feed a good response to this inquiry. I am a nerd by history in this kind of vernacular and the tropes, and part of me almost was like, I worry that the depth of the film that it's kind of trying to engender, and the empathy it's trying to create, gets a little undercut by kind of the comic bookiness of it. Maybe that's just me being unfair, I don't know, but
the comic bookiness of, like, they're trying to connect this directly to, like, Bruce Wayne.
Well, yeah, definitely that. I did not love that whatsoever, but that's just me being a super nerd. I think mainly it was just like, if you know anything about the comic book zeitgeist, you know who the character of Joker is, and that he's ultimately a bad guy, and is the empathy you're trying to garner in me a bit short-circuited by, but he's still the Joker. Anyway.
He's still Joker.
Right.
Well, I think that's exactly what it's trying to subvert. It's having us question who are the villains, I mean, we know who Joker is because he's a mass murderer and he's quite violent and all of these things. And the film, quite baldly, is trying to have us understand what creates a monster, so to speak.
Sure.
And I mean, that's it on its face. I mean, that's just like to be exactly what they're trying to do, and it's not the whole picture to me. I mean, for some people, a terrorist is a freedom fighter, and I don't think the film is like that smart. I don't think it's like going quite in that direction.
Right.
But it's it's about how we perceive what it means to be villainous, I think.
Totally. And there's a world in which even me bringing that up as a possible critique feels like I am undercutting my own sort of
well, and that's the troublesome of the movie. It's like this Ouroboros of, what does this all mean? Like, I don't know.
Sure. Well, I just give you props for in context using the word Ouroboros. I mean, it's just really proud to know you, even if for just the 45 minutes we've been talking. That's great. I'm a big word nerd. So I feel like, I want to spend a few more minutes here just kind of riffing a little bit. It's funny. I often think, I don't know if you listen to On Being, the NPR podcast with Krista Tippett, but it's really, really great stuff. And she speaks to people of all different kind of backgrounds and traditions and that sort of thing, and asks about spiritual journeys and stuff like that. And, something you, at a certain point in the latter part of your article, something I love is how you state that the film, and the phrase you use is, calls you to account for how you interacted with your mother in your younger years. And one, I even ignore kind of the question marks that to me invokes of sort of, interior life and that kind of journey and that sort of thing. I do just love the capacity of art to do that, right? Like to someone, I can't tell you how many times I've encountered people who, even people I love and I'm close to, like, oh, Joker, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, well, or pick anything, right? Pick a film that has some sort of divisive type of narrative attached to it in the real world. And it's like, well, I mean, did you see it? Oh, no. Well, right. Okay.
Right.
Well, and honestly, I actually referenced this on our Joker recording. One of these folks that I'm sort of alluding to in my outer concentric circles of kind of engagement posted some real kind of fundamentalist faith, basically hit piece around the time Joker came out. And because one, I'm a glutton for punishment, and two, I just like to know the angles on a conversation culturally. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm going to go read this. It's probably not going to be with the best of intentions, but I'm going to go read it. And sure enough, in the piece, it and I'd already seen the movie at that point. That's how I operate, is though I will watch trailers, I won't read the think pieces until after I've seen it. So I'd seen the film, and now I'm sort of in consume mode and reflect mode. So I go and read this article, and the piece makes some reference to, again, I had just watched it, something that doesn't even happen in the movie. And I get to the end of it, and the author makes a reference to, oh, and I'm probably not even going to see it, or something real blithe and dismissive. And I was like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe you actually published this sort of quote unquote think piece, or, piece of criticism that isn't even engaging with the film, because by your own admission in the piece, you didn't watch it. That's like really bad form.
It's pretty egregious.
It is. It totally. But it's that kind of thing I feel like we often wrestle with, where, or at least I feel like I see a lot, where it's like, okay, I hear that you feel like you need to be critical of a thing, but have you watched it? No. Okay. Well, maybe don't be critical. Like maybe there's something attached to it. Like for me, I love Adam Sandler's smarter pieces in his oeuvre. I don't love his comedies. Now I am, and by that extension, I'm prone to like Uncut Gems, because I do like his, kind of more serious takes in his career. So I'm not going to be like this other guy over here and say, oh, I'm not going to see Uncut Gems because Adam Sandler. Well, I respect people who talk well of that film, but just as a random example there. But the point being, when you talk about how the film calls you to account, and the power that art can have to do that, I just wondered, I've read the article, and listeners will have the opportunity to read it too, but you reference in the opening paragraph or so about your mother's religious fundamentalism, which, however, and you can speak to that or not, but, are you open to chat about, how one, that shaped your view of God or religion, kind of in your younger years, and do things like a Joker film and maybe your own sort of dabblings in life, in the way that the film you say calls you to account for that relationship with your mom? Does that does that extend to any sort of understanding or appreciation for, the world of religion, knowing kind of her brand was toxic, but not necessarily representative of the entirety, at least, of a well-formed, kind of mature spiritual expression? And I'm going to caveat there too, just know you're in good company as someone who has been wounded and burned by that world. So it's not like I'm saying, isn't religion great? That's not at all where I'm going. Just trying to inquire, kind of how that has engaged you.
Yeah, not a problem. So I do want to go back to what you're saying, like the call to account phrase.
Sure.
Thank you to my editor, because he was the one that actually gifted me with this idea. I think he had pulled that from what I had written, and sort of it was a great unifying force, and I will keep going back to that.
Sure.
So thank you to my editor at Washington Post. I really appreciate that, because that was a wonderful thing that he gifted me.
Yeah.
So because I think, like you're saying, it encapsulates it, so I can't take credit for it. But he pulled it from, I think, what I was writing about, and he just it was his little way of putting a little bow on everything.
That's awesome.
Which I
That's
appreciate.
awesome.
So thank you to editors. So in terms of religion, it's funny you mention it. It's hard to talk about my mother's sense of religion because I don't actually think of her as religious, even though there's like a certain zealotry there. And that's because I've never connected her manifestations of her illness with like what I consider like true piousness.
Sure.
And I use the word pious or zealotry almost as like a shorthand because it's really hard to describe if you don't know the exact. If you don't know what I'm referring to, it's just easy enough to like describe my mom's behaviors as like what we would normally think of as like fundamentalist or zealotous or zealotry.
Sure,
zealotous,
we'll go with it.
Exactly.
We'll kick it up to the editor.
Right. I've just never thought of her as an actual like religious stronghold and stronghold in her heart. So my family is Jewish.
Okay.
And what I was steeped in growing up was a lot of like anything that was not Jewish was a bad thing, essentially, in my mom's view. So I kind of had to unpeel myself from that as I got older. I think one of the things you had asked earlier, or maybe we talked a little bit, is like, what are some of the things that scare you?
Sure.
And I would say that I read a lot of Harry Potter. I'm a big Harry Potter fan since I was a kid. And I always thought, well, my boggart would be being ill like my mom. I mean, that is probably like my biggest, has always been my biggest fear. 10.
I just need to pause you real quick, Robyn, and totally celebrate the moment that's happening here. Because one, listeners won't know, I actually forgot to ask you that question, but thank you for bringing it back up. But I mean, come on, the intersection of Harry Potter and religion and fear and pop culture. This is a really beautiful moment that's happening right now. So please carry on. Yes.
Well, you created it. So my boggart has always been, even since I was little, like I knew that having an illness like my mother's would be a terrible nightmare. I mean, speaking of nightmares, and I don't mean to diminish anybody who has her diagnosis.
Sure.
Or anything like that. Everybody has a completely different experience with psychosis, and for some people, it's manageable, and for my mom, it became less so as she grew older. But that happened for lots of different reasons in our life. So, my mother, her illness was very paranoid. She hallucinated. She had like a lot of auditory hallucinations. She often seemed like she was in another realm, so to speak. So, and 10% of children who have that particular diagnosis develop it at some point. So, I've always had doctors say to me, like, don't do weed, don't take cannabis, monitor your drinking.
Sure.
So I always have to, I'm not like a prude or anything. Well, maybe I am in some ways, but I'm not really a prude when it comes to like other people's substance habits.
Sure.
But I always have to be like, I can't. No, I've never
Right,
and I always say,
right.
oh, I'm a nerd or whatever, because it's really hard to say, oh, well, actually, like I might be opening up my brain
Right.
to
You're like, how much
some
time do you
problematic
have?
chemicals. Yeah, exactly. So the reason I mention this, thinking, we think about fear, we think of this, and people joke, oh, I'm so afraid of turning to my mother, but it's not that I'm afraid of being my mother. My mother was actually a really wonderful person
Hmm.
and a really sweet person. And I think in the piece I grapple with knowing this other side of her that to me was her when I was growing up, and she scared me growing up. I mean,
Sure.
I remember calling her the Trunchbull because she reminded me so much of the Trunchbull from Matilda.
Wow.
Which is again one of these unkind
Sure,
things that I
sure.
would do that felt protective to me when I was that age because I could connect with it. And so of course I look back sometimes to think, oh, that's so unfair. My mother had such a hard life. She was ill, things that are outside of
Right.
control. So the religion thing, the fear thing for me growing up, I was afraid of Jesus. Like I had
Wow.
no idea who this person
Right.
was. I used to get in trouble for like watching anything Christmas related. Like it was a big problem in my household.
Wow.
Because this is how my mother's illness manifested.
Right.
She wasn't. It's hard to say like, oh, like I don't mean to diminish. Like again, was this her true belief or was this
Right.
her illness manifesting? So I don't want to like diminish either one.
Sure.
But I never really saw her as like somebody who was super religious. I mean, we didn't go to synagogue or anything. Maybe I went to Hebrew school, but that didn't really continue. So I never really felt like I was in a particularly religious household.
Right.
Even though we were very steeped in being Jewish, and have those traditions, and it's important to me to be Jewish, even though I'm not. Even though I would say I'm a fairly secular person, because Jewishness sort of encompasses all sorts of different things.
Right.
And it's something that you're born into, and you can convert into, and there was like this debate recently about Bernie Sanders, and like he was considered unaffiliated religiously, but actually. By the tenets of Judaism, he will always be a Jew, whether he believes in God or not. Does not unaffiliate you with Judaism.
Right.
There are lots of Jews, like avowed Jews, who are not, who are agnostic or atheists. So it's all kind of jumbled in my head a little bit.
Sure.
And I think for Judaism specifically, it's something I vacillated with, because one of the big ways that my mother's illness manifested was that she used to make me promise when I was little that I would marry a Jewish man, like from the earliest age of my life.
Right.
Which again is one of those like funny stories I tell people. And so I would get in trouble if there was any inkling that I was like not going to do this.
Sure.
Of course, yeah, it's kind of messy. Again, I'm not super religious, but my parents passed away when I was in college, and that is when I actually started to care more about religion, because it was taken away from me, this sense of family, the sense of community. Like a lot of people in my family passed away in a very short period of time, like my extended family. So that was kind of ripped from me, and so I kind of like sunk into the Jewish world after college, and I actually learned so much more about my religion than I ever did when I was a kid.
Very cool.
Because I was trying to connect to the sense of community, family, life, your people, so to speak. And so I've kind of jumped back and forth on that question, but I've never really connected it to my mother's feelings, just because she was outside of the realm of faith in some ways, even though she was a believer, of course. But I can't take her her personal feelings as like
representative.
The representative. Yeah, I wouldn't call her like a super religious person. This is not how most Jewish people are,
right?
For sure.
Well, and I think it does. I mean, to your credit, I think it takes a lot of, maturity and dare I say wisdom to be able to kind of parse that way. And because I think it would also be real easy to have the flip side have happened, which is to totally entwine those things,
Yeah, probably.
Although it is interesting, your boggart suffering similar illness patterns. At the same time, I'm going to juxtapose that with your fascination with body horror, which is all about losing control of oneself, right? So there you go. I mean, welcome to the fear of God, Robyn. You just got psychoanalyzed.
Oh, yeah. I feel like I just fell into like a deep pit or something.
I will receive that as a compliment. No,
in a good way.
Good.
Sludge pit.
Yes.
Horror.
Well, and kind of to put a little button perhaps on maybe our time together, but also just this part of the conversation. You brushed up against this in the last few minutes, and in summary, a summary statement, I think, is your own words in the article, and I love. And towards the very end, you just say, "It's clear to me now that my unfair expectations suffocated her as much as I felt suffocated by her symptoms." And the specificity of your mother's illness notwithstanding, all of us can benefit from just sort of as we I feel like at times on the fear of God we have many mantras. It's like the holy and the horrific, dissecting what scares us to find what saves us. But another one of them is we explore, we don't explain. It's not about didactic, dogmatic, sort of rigid strictures. It's about just exploring these things and sort of totally unrelated to this conversation, but I was talking to a buddy just 2 days ago. There's a gentleman from the Christian publishing world who passed away a couple of years ago named Eugene Peterson. And Eugene Peterson has a lot of just wisdom to offer. But I think it's the title of one of his books is called "We Make the Road by Walking." And I just love that so much because in fear of God parlance, it's the same idea. We're not here to just wag a finger or say this is meant to be your takeaway and that sort of thing. It's just we just probe the boundaries and get inspired and discover what we discover, or in his words, we make the road by walking. So one, thank you so much. This has been a real delight, and with sincerity I say we would love to have you back sometime. We do have a literary correspondent. You could be our film and critic correspondent or something like that. And we'll let you pick the film. Thank you for being here, willing to put yourself out there in your writing, and agreeing to be on the show. Tell listeners where they can find your work, whether it's to the far reach of the internet or any sort of centralized location. Where can we find the work of Robyn Bahr?
Sure. I have a website. It's called yentavision.com. That's just where I kind of keep everything that doesn't belong anywhere else. My Oscar prognostication or whatever. But I write for I've written for a few different publications. You probably find most of my pieces at the Hollywood Reporter. I'm a freelancer with them. But you can also find me at Robyn Bahr on Twitter. So it's like at ROBYNBAHR.
Awesome. On Yentavision, I did stumble upon, I don't know if it was the recipe or just an outline for the raspberry cobbler, and that looked amazing.
Oh, yeah.
That looked amazing. I'm just going to be honest. That looked amazing.
Again, just stuff that doesn't fit anywhere else. Like my recipes, or like here's a listicle about, I don't know, like my top 10 favorite films of the year. I don't know.
Hey. We are not one thing, and so I applaud you for putting them all in the bucket. Well, Robyn, once more, thank you. Listeners, consider this a coda on our best of 2019 horror series. Go look up Robyn's stuff, send her a message, let her know you appreciate her being on, and also consider this episode a preface to our umbrella series for the year, titled 2020, which starts next week with 2000's Shadow of the Vampire, starring Willem Dafoe and John Malkovich, a wonderful film. Have you seen that, Robyn?
I haven't. I actually didn't realize it came out in 2000.
Yeah, it's It's good
Wow.
stuff.
It's not that long ago.
Right. It's excellent. You'd really enjoy it. Once more, thank you, Robyn. Listeners, as we have begun saying in 2020, and as our sign off here, fear nothing else and be on your way rejoicing. We'll see you next week, guys.